Hi, and welcome to Rave Leader Chat number 9 for the Gospel of Mark. Once again, it's just a blessing to dive into this text and to share some insights with you, talk about where kind of we are as well, and let you know of a scheduling update later in the video. As you've experienced, you've seen the text get not only longer but fuller. There's more substantive things that are taking place. The themes aren't necessarily all one. And so I've talked to a couple of people after this past weeks, and they just said there's so much to talk about, we can never get it all out. And that's really the challenge of trying to do the gospel in 20 weeks. But I rejoice in your partnership in the gospel and your willingness to lead. This is the blessing it is to sort of teach and lead, is that you see so much more that's there. And you just rejoice when people dig in and get a sample of what you've been able to be blessed with. So thanks again. Know that I continue to pray for you, and let's dive into this week's text as we look really at all of chapter 8 and the first verse in chapter 9. The first passage is about the feeding of the 4,000. There's some scholars that say this is just a rewriting of the 5,000 or a mistake, and really the details are so different. And I think it's we can make a really strong case that it's a separate account. For two reasons. One is the details, and second is the purpose. That the feeding of the 5,000 was definitely in a Jewish area, although that's not explicitly explained in the text. And this one's a Gentile. And so you've got that balance again that we saw last week with the children and the dogs, that Jesus did come first for the Israelites, but also for the Gentiles. And so the questions that are there are very good, especially question 1 and 2. How is it that the disciples miss, and how can we sort of be like that? And if we think back through the people of faith, that's one of our biggest critiques of the Israelites and the wilderness wanderings, right? They continue to sort of miss and not learn the lesson. So great conversation there. Moving on to the second part, the Pharisees demand a sign in verses 9 through 13. It's interesting. There's some discussion that'll be happen in your group. Well, doesn't Jesus do miracles in other places? And the reality in the New Testament is Jesus usually does miracles, either to highlight compassion or to teach some other aspect of the gospel. They're never really done just as a showing, a flexing of divine muscle so that he might see it. And really, the way that the Pharisees ask the question, they're really asking for this. Can you give us an outward compelling proof of your divine authority? Well, if they're not able to see that with the healing of the leper or the healing of the lame man earlier, they're not going to see it if it's just for their amusement. And so Jesus, throughout the Gospels, really sort of downplays miracles for miracles' sake. They serve an additional purpose, and so there's sort of some good conversation there. The next passage, 14 to 21, is really a two kind of fold discussion, one on the leaven of the others compared to Jesus. And I think that question 5 is a good one to talk about the Pharisees and Herod and the leaven that they are, and how does that kind of work in. Leaven usually biblically has a negative connotation, can have a positive, but here it's really, that idea, that worldview, that maybe that sort of antithetical approach to Jesus really can work through and kind of impact the whole loaf. And then it really turns on the disciples as they are struggling with a lack of fuller understanding. And that's a really important theme that's going to play out through the rest of this. It's one thing to not know. It's another thing to know and have partial understanding. And that's a theme that continues to work. And it could be argued that we're actually more dangerous when we got half the story right rather than having none of the story right. When we have none of the story right, everyone knows we don't have the story right. When we've got a good chunk of the story right and it's wrong, we actually sort of sound authoritative and Jesus-y, and yet we can have it wrong. Then we get to a unique story that I'll call it the twofold healing. It's really the only place in the gospel where it takes Jesus twice to do it. And I want you to think about that, and I want your group to think about that. And so in question 7, I'd really add an additional question: why? Jesus speaks and storms are stilled. Jesus touches lepers and lepers are clean. Jesus heals people from a distance. This is not about Jesus' power or lack of power. It's not that this guy had like double hard glaucoma that had to be healed. There's a purpose and why Jesus intentionally does a twofold healing. It's by godly design that he does it. And so it really is a great question for us to discuss. Why does Jesus take 2 times to do it? And think about how that sandwich between the 2 texts that it is. Then we get to Peter's confession. And Peter's confession is the high point. It really is the Gospel of Mark really builds up to this moment. And then from this moment forward, things are going to shift. This first 8 chapters has really been sort of crisscrossing Galilee and moving all over the place. And really after this confession, things are going to move toward Jerusalem and be very focused there. And so this is sort of the pinnacle moment. It's the question that all of us have to ask. Jesus does a masterful job of asking it. What do people say? Yeah, but what do you say? And this is really the question each one of us needs to answer. And the whole gospel has been sort of begging the question, who is this Jesus? And at some point we need to weigh in. It's interesting it comes in the middle of the gospel because they haven't seen everything yet. But it's a good reminder to us that you need to weigh in even when you don't have all the information and see what happens with that. That confession is then met with correction. Is immediately after this, Jesus begins to teach them. And I love that corresponding. Jesus begins to teach, and what he's specifically teaching is that he must go and suffer, that he's going to be a suffering Messiah, which was very surprising at the time. We understand Peter's reticence to say something different. But just as Jesus begins teaching, Peter begins rebuking. And that's an incredible interplay for us to think about. And then he gets the correction. Jesus' response to Peter's rebuking is a rebuke back so that he might get it right. I really want to commend questions 10 and 11 to you. 10 is fantastic about why Jesus is so harsh, and I think that's a great thing for us to think about. It challenges our understanding of friendly or buddy Jesus that always just pats us on the back. What's the role of divine correction when we get something wrong? And then verse 11, I think, is a great question. It ties back into that twofold healing that I think will help us answer that question a little bit more. After that, we really get to what are the terms of discipleship? What does it really look like? And really the underlying question is, once we understand what kind of Messiah Jesus is going to be, and we confess belief in that Messiah, it greatly impacts our understanding and expectation of what discipleship is. And so that's really the interplay there. And that's why this kind of comes on the heels of that. What are the implications for us as disciples when that takes place? So great stuff this week. I am excited for you and your groups. This is just chock full. You're never going to be able to do it all, but wow, what God's going to be able to do in and through your group as the Holy Spirit moves in your midst and brings these words to life and writes them on people's hearts. I did mention that although study guide-wise, we're only 9 out of 20 weeks, we really are halfway through the gospel in sort of a design sense. And so I just want to applaud you for getting this far and keep up the good work. Second, as we look at the schedule forward, I want to let you know that there's going to be a mid-course correction, if you will, really a swapping of 2 weeks. So in a few weeks, we're going to swap. We're going to actually just do them in alternate order. We're going to do lesson 14 before we do lesson 13. And the reason is that lesson 14 is the text for Palm Sunday, and it just seems appropriate to do that on Palm Sunday and discuss it the week after. And so really we will do lesson 14 on April 5th. We'll begin the beginning of that. We'll actually take the week of Easter off because we want to preach something different on Easter Sunday than that other passage. And then we'll return on April 19th to lesson 13. Last, I just want to continue to remind you that we are pursuing well-rounded discipleship, and that really is incumbent upon you, and we really need your help to continue to lift up those 6 marks of discipleship. And the one I want to highlight today is that reaching out to someone who's far off from God and inviting them to come in with their questions and discover. And so maybe it's a part of your group to say, who do you think would be blessed to be with us, and maybe list a couple names, pray for those names, and maybe start to think about ways that you could sort of one on one, and maybe in sort of tag team, invite people that you might encourage them to come. Be able to rub shoulders with the rest of the saints in your group to be prayed for, but also to have a small and safe place for them to walk through part of the scriptures and ask their questions and receive some answers. So thanks again for all that you're doing. Just so blessed to be on this journey with you. I know that you're continue to be in my thoughts and prayers. Take care and God bless.